So when Elon told me yesterday that there is an open slot for me, my first reaction was going to tell you about the most exciting story that I'm currently involved in, which is this work trying to understand deep neural networks, or as it is called now by machine learning people, deep learning, and why it works so well. And it's really an exciting story. It's a joint work with Noga Zaslavsky, who is a student of ELSEC, who is sitting here patiently. But so just for those, after talking to some people here and realizing that there are many here who actually don't know what deep learning is, certainly don't know why is it so exciting that we understand it. I just want to give you one slide. Essentially, as you all know, I mean, deep neural network, the idea of neural network has been around for essentially 60 years maybe, since or even more, 70, 80 years, since the 40s. And the idea of using it for pattern recognition, which was really inspired by the brain, came up and down and up and down and up again several times in this period, which is actually quite exciting historically. And essentially right now, these models which really try to mimic layered networks in the brain in many sensory peripheral systems like vision, auditory, and so on, are actually doing better on pattern recognition problems in machine learning in general than any other method known today, better than all the sophisticated theories like support vector machines and kernel method and all that. And they changed just very little from the original ideas of Frank Rosenblatt from the 60s and later the PDP connectionism of the 80s and so on. The main difference is now that they are really stacking many, many layers, sometimes tens of layers of neurons, of formal neurons, I mean the McCulloch-Pitts type of neurons. And essentially, as I say, they do better than essentially anything else on almost any problem you throw at them, like vision and speech recognition and computational biology and natural language understanding and so on and so forth. And it becomes an incredibly frustrating thing for theoreticians because people really didn't understand why they work so well. So what we did in the past several months, which I'm not going to talk about, is really try to put this framework into a more systematic theoretical framework, which is actually related to what I am going to talk about. It's information theoretic in flavor, and we actually believe or begin to believe that we may have deeper understanding of deep learning through all the ideas coming from information theory. But since this is a rather mixed audience and I didn't want to be too technical, and actually I gave this talk several times in the past few weeks and even to experts, and I realized that it's not very easy to digest, so I decided to go to my older ideas, which is actually closely related to the ideas we apply to deep learning, but I think this story is easier to digest right now. So I apologize for many of you who heard some of it in different versions before. So essentially, this notion of predictive information, or the information that the past convey about the future, is really a fundamental concept in many ways that many in brain science or in cognitive neuroscience are taking more and more seriously. I must say that as far as I'm concerned, the idea that life is about exploiting information from the past with respect to the future is so fundamental that I actually take it as the very definition of life. So essentially, and of course, when we ask what life is, I mean, this is really what we call a high-level question. Usually, you associate it with metabolic exchange of matter and energy, like photosynthesis or things like this, or self-replication, like self-reproduction, or maybe things that are associated with dissipation and adaptation, all like the emergence of interesting structure like snowflakes and things like this. All those systems, all those properties, I mean, metabolic exchange, self-replication, adaptation in some sense, or dissipation-driven adaptation, which is actually a very exciting topic in pattern formation in physics. All of them are associated with some definitions of life, and I consider all of them to be false in the sense that there are many things that are not living that actually have these properties. Actually, all the slides that I show can exhibit several examples of systems which you wouldn't like to call living systems, which have them. So according to this notion of sometimes called the predictive brain or predictive cause, life is really about systems that in some sense move from causal system to predictive systems. And essentially for me, the essence of life is the ability to exploit in some sense the predictability of the environment for, in order to survive. If you think about these two animals, the future life depends very much on their ability to make short or long-term predictions. So in that sense, life for me is really the ability to exploit the predictability of the environment for survivability. Now, from that, this is very general and very generally accepted, and people are talking about the predictive brain now very seriously and in many, many different ways. From this point on, I actually go down and try to formulate it in a very precise mathematical way, using essentially one principle, which is what do we actually mean by exploiting the predictability of the environment, and then take it very seriously upward and try to tailor it again or connect it again with concrete predictions about behaving systems and about neuroscience at various levels. And that's essentially the story I want to tell you today. So essentially, in order to take it seriously, we need several mathematical definitions. One of them is this notion of what we call predictive information. Okay, what I mean by that is a quantity which I will define in a few minutes. Essentially, it's just that. I mean, how much of our past determine the future? Or what is in the past which allows us to exploit the future in a valuable way? Now, it turns out that there is a concrete mathematical definition that satisfies, at least to my satisfaction, this notion, and it has to do, again, with life being some sort of a system that exploits sensory information in order to achieve valuable behavior. So I want to build it from some very simple examples, as I often do. Consider this interesting animal or living system. So this is essentially almost the simplest I could imagine system that has these two basic features. Sensory system, I mean, it has some sensory information that comes through mechanical, optical, maybe other type of sensors or sensory apparatus that it has. And on the other hand, it has behavior. I mean, it can move around. And if you think about it, it actually has some sort of cycle of information between something which you may call its brain, I mean, its internal representation, some sort of a finite state machine, and the environment around it. And this type of information flow between the environment and the object is really critical for anything that we would like to call a living organism. And in this particular case, I mean, this is a very, if at all you are willing to call it a living organism, it's a very primitive organism because it has a very short span of memory and planning. So it has what we call, in this case, Daniel Polanyi and me, we call it metabolic information processing. Essentially, it receives the information immediately uses it. So there's some sort of sensing and then immediately acting in a very short time window. So this type of information processing, despite its simplicity, is already interesting enough to study both from engineering perspective and from biological perspective. I'll try to convince you that this is true. But obviously, usually we think about, so in this case, I mean, information is actually used in the same way we use oxygen. I mean, we inhale and exhale information immediately. So this is why I call it metabolic information processing. But obviously, we are thinking about something much more interesting, like, for example, playing chess. And when you play chess, you do something a lot more sophisticated. I mean, you're using information in order to reach a long-term goal, winning the game, for example. And essentially, what you do, whether you do it explicitly or implicitly, is think about the goal and then bring back the information from the future to you. I mean, if I want to get home at 7 tonight, where should I be at 6:30? And where should I be at 6, and so on. And this flow back of information from the future, I know where I am now, I know where I want to be, and I need to propagate information backward. This is precisely the key mechanism of what we call optimal control. So optimal control is the theory developed by engineers, essentially, in order to build systems that know how to plan. But it gives us also the explicit mathematics that contain these two flows of information. Backward from the past to estimate where I am now, the state estimation process, and forward from the past, and backward from the future to actually estimate what should I do now in order to get there. And combining these two flows of information allows me to make much more sophisticated behavior. Obviously, for those of you who know something about it, and there are people here who know something about it, you can't really win chess, for example, by optimal control. Why not? Mainly because you really don't know where are you going to win the game. I mean, there are almost infinitely many possible mate positions, and you don't know which one of them you're going to end up with. And it doesn't depend only on you, it depends on your opponent as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty in playing the game. It's very different from playing a GPS route to home, where I know exactly where I want to be, and I can simply track back the way here, as every GPS planning is doing. This playing chess is a lot more complicated. There's a lot of uncertainty of the way. So obviously what good chess players are doing is they don't really see the end of the game. Usually they try to look as far as possible into the future, 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 moves ahead. And when they get there, they want to be in the best possible position, which means they want to keep the options as open as possible. And that's actually a mechanism for behavior that we are studying in my group very seriously. I mean, this is known in robotics, for example. People call it maximize empowerment. I mean, maximize the options of behavior. You don't really know where you're going to get, but you want to keep as many options, to keep as many of your tools or your moves allow. But in terms of the mathematics, it's already a lot more interesting and complicated than just metabolic processing of information, which you immediately react to the information you receive. And of course, there's also even more complicated games than chess, where you don't see the board, or you don't see exactly the board. You have only noisy information on the environment, and you have to estimate where you are based on a lot of observation and learning. And this is really the maximum complexity that we can think of, where the world itself is not known to you. So in a sense, we are thinking about animals or living organisms as machines that encode past observations in a clever way through their interaction with the world, and eventually generate actions. And their actions actually serve two goals, which are intertwined together. I mean, they're very often not clearly distinguished. One of them is really to improve their position or get reward, immediate or future reward. I mean, do the best move that you can in order to achieve the maximum reward. This is the standard paradigm of what we call reinforcement learning. I mean, maximize the expected future reward. But on the other hand, actions have other goal, which is often ignored. I tend to emphasize this maybe too much. They are actually measurements or queries about the environment. I mean, some of my actions are essentially in order to gain information, to gather information from the world. So there are, for example, games like 20-question games or things like this, which are called pure information games, where your actions are just ask questions and get the response of the environment. So essentially, it's only information gathering mechanism. And there are some other games, like moving in a maze, where the actions simply propagate you in space. But imagine that you are moving in an unknown maze. Then your actions do both. I mean, move you in the maze and discover the structure of the maze at the same time. So one of the basic things that we are trying to achieve in our formalism to this is really make a clear distinction between these two things: measurement and estimation that gather information, and actions that actually propagate you towards the goal or toward better reward. So again, in that sense, we are talking in the language of many neuroscientists. I usually mention Fuster, but there are many others that introduce this notion of the perception-action cycle, or essentially thinking about organism and the brain in particular as a machine that interacts with the environment by action, receives senses which are, as I said, both as the result of the action and as the result of just sensing the world, and try to do this in a very efficient way. The focus of this talk is really to show you that if you take into account this notion of information very seriously, which I think many people who do control theory or even reinforcement learning in various forms ignore, you actually get a lot out of this structure and of this concept. And one of them, maybe the most exciting one, was not new to many of you, is the fact that, in a sense, those perception-action cycles, it's not one cycle, there are many cycles on many time scales. So even if you think about our brain, of course, I don't have to tell it to anybody, so largely speaking, we have the frontal brain cortex, not only cortex, that deals mostly with what I call here the red part, or the active part, the executive part of the brain. I mean, decisions, actions, planning, and so on, future-looking behavior or cognition. And there is the perceptual part, which is the dorsal part of our, mostly the dorsal, and actually there's a very nice and very sharp split in the sensory motor cortex that really divide these two things very, very clearly in the cortex, at least. Although, of course, everything else is mixed up. But if you think about it in terms of the times of the cycle, there's this sensory motor, very quick cycle that happens when I just touch the stable and I immediately get the reaction of my muscles to hold it against me. So this is orders of tens of hundreds of milliseconds, tens of milliseconds, all the way to essentially thinking about minutes, hours, days, weeks, years, tens of years. And essentially, I really believe that what really makes us so special, or makes us human, is precisely our ability to really think essentially about indefinite past and indefinite future. There's no hardware constraint in our brain that really forbids us to thinking about very, very long times. Although originally those very short cycles seem to be anchored at some very specific hardware, like the sensory motor cycle. Eventually, somehow we discover this trick of applying it to larger and larger times. And this is something which we sometimes call cognitive hierarchies or perceptual and planning hierarchies, which is really one of the key questions I'm trying to answer. When how is it evolving? Or what is really the mathematics behind it? And I actually argue that this ability to think about indefinite future or indefinite past is very special. I mean, it's not something that happens everywhere all the time. It requires some very fine-tuning of parameters, and that happens in our brain, and therefore puts some very interesting constraints on the way the brain is structured. So again, we introduce all sorts of different types of mathematics. I just want to hint, just to show you that there is actually a lot of mathematical formulation behind it. So we really think about, again, how to formulate this notion of how the past affects the future. So just here for this mixed audience, I'm going to show it in a very high level. So essentially, there are three different formal constructs that one can use in order to analyze or to model this type of thing. The first one is what is under A here, is what we call automatons, or machines that essentially have states. in this case, 1, 2, or 3. And those states represent my internal representation of the world, if you want. So those of you who are familiar with automatons, for example, hidden Markov models or things like this, also have states that's supposed to represent what we know. And those actions, which are the red things, and the observation, which are the blue things, change the state, move us from one state to another. And this type of construct, in computer science at least, or in mathematics, is known, is a very well understood. It's a finite state machine with transitions that depend on observations and behavior, and essentially allow us to write a very nice formalism for both learning such automatons from the experience, developing them, finding the minimal or the best, optimal in some sense, in terms of number of states. We know how those states evolve, how they can form, and so on. So there's a lot of mathematics associated with understanding this model. And at least in my group, we have been studying how to learn automatons like this for at least 25 years. The other way of thinking about past and future is what you see here in C, which is essentially the time cone. So the future is all the possible tree of possibilities that lie ahead of us. How many possible futures can be to a given state? So when I play chess, there are many, many possible games that follow. These are the possible futures. And the histories of the past are those particular trajectories we actually went through. And again, the relationship between them is precisely this notion of how much the past is really constraining the future, is precisely this notion of future of predictive information, which I'm going to define. And there's another model which is newer, which has to do with what people call probabilistic graphical models or Bayesian networks or many other names. Essentially, we can think about both of them in some sense. We can span this automaton in time and think about it as if the world is moving in a Markov chain from one time to the next, and the brain or the mind or memory, whatever, is moving in another Markov chain from one time to the next. And these two chains are interacting through observations and actions, which can change both of them, so there's some sort of interaction between them. This particular model is relatively new for this particular purpose, and this is what we use in order to impose information constraints on behavior. So essentially, we are trying to think about these two things as channels that communicate information between us and the world. And we want to ask, okay, what happens if these are limited channels? We can't really sense everything, and we can't really do everything. We are limiting the capacity of these two channels. And at the same time, there's this memory channel, how much we have to remember from the past in order to behave well. So these are essentially the three models that we use. And the big picture that I always show is really what the brain is doing, is essentially trying to compress in some intelligent way the information from the past in order to exploit as much as possible the value of actions in the future. And as I said, this can be captured mathematically by essentially measuring the mutual information between the past and the future and trying to minimize as much as possible the information that I need to store under the constraint, or two constraints essentially, the metabolic cost of sensing and the value of my actions. Now, again, without getting into detail, believe me that what I just said can be translated into very precise mathematics, and this is what's really nice about it. There's one function that depends only on the environment, which determines how much information is there in the past about the future. And surprisingly, I actually argue that this particular function is the main determinant of the complexity of life around us. So if there's very little information in the past about the future, we are living in a very chaotic environment, life could not evolve to anything interesting. And the more information we have from past about the future, the more we can exploit and the more complicated we can become. And actually, life itself is organizing the environment in a way that makes it more predictable and allow us to organize societies and organize culture and so on and so forth. But what is really interesting about it is that if you actually look quantitatively at how much information is there in the past about the future, you find out typically a picture like this, which means if you look just very little bit into the past, you get immediately a very big jump about the future. So the immediate past is very predictive. But once you gather more and more information, the amount of information it gives you about the future is getting lower and lower. There's some basic law of diminishing returns. This is what we call sublinear or sub-extensive behavior. So essentially, the predicted information is not growing linearly with time, no matter how complicated the world is. So this can be sound as very bad news, which means generally we cannot really make good long-term predictions. But actually, it's a very good news, because this is the reason why our limited brains can really function quite well. Essentially, you can, with very limited information, you can really get quite far ahead. So even the brain of a fly can already make relatively long-term predictions. But what is also very interesting about this type of curve, which, as I said, we can calculate in some sense, is that it has interesting points on it, which we call phase transitions, where essentially the complexity of those red points, those phase transitions actually happen to be very important also for understanding deep learning, but that's a different story. And those phase transitions mark some sort of jump in the complexity of the representation, like adding more states, adding more memory, adding more dimensionalities of exploring the world. And if you don't make this transition, you're going to end up on some of those black sub-optimal curves. So this is really a very basic and very fundamental picture that really characterizes just any machine that is trying to exploit information about the world. And it turns out that those critical steps are really the key to understand the uniqueness and those hard constraints on the ability of living organisms to survive. Okay, so what I want to do now is jump ahead to some other stories. So again, in this predictive thinking, okay, I need some sort of jumps in my complexity in order to get higher and higher, exploit better and better the future. But at the same time, I'm going to show you a different curve right now, which is going to relate directly to this notion of perception. So again, if what we do, and I'm jumping a little bit here, if what we actually do is making predictions or planning into the future and then take it backward in order to make sense of it. So what we actually do in perception, and this is again a big story that I'm just throwing at you in one sentence, we must have some sort of a top-down process. I first guess and then process. So this idea that our perception is actually predictive, we first make high-level prediction on very little information and then go backward and find the details is again very fundamental and is of course known to everyone here at least by this notion of that it was developed by Shaul and Merav and others as the reverse hierarchy theory. Is essentially, in my view, this idea that we somehow begin the perception by rough coarse-grained processing of first we think that there is a dog there, or we think that there is a man there, or we think that there is a tree there, and then we go backward in order to verify this hypothesis. So essentially what the brain is doing in this language is creating hypotheses about the environment and then check them at the low level. So there's a direct and clear link between the reverse hierarchy models, both in visual perception, auditory perception, again, without getting into too many details, but at least in auditory perception, it's even clearer that we first guess and then encode, then decode. First guess what we hear and then make sense of it. There's a direct and immediate link between these pictures and the idea that we are making predictions. But I'm going to take this one step further. I really want to see what dictates those hierarchies. Not only why does, as you can see even in this picture, there's a clear connection between those hierarchies and the layers of representations in our brain. I'm sure that Shaul had this in mind in some sense when we talk about it. And I actually argue that those layers are related in some sense to those phase transitions in the predicted information. And without, maybe before, I just want to argue how can this happen. So I want to give just this picture taken from a paper with Pedro Ortega, which just wrote last year. So essentially, what I told you about predictive information, to think about this as time, and think about this as the information that we have about the future in that sense. Okay, so I told you that actually our knowledge about the future is diluted. I mean, we know more about the immediate future, and the further we look into the future, we know less about the future. So this is one aspect of this sub-extensivity of predictive information. Now, on the other hand, I want to allocate hardware in my brain, states of those automatons or whatever it is, in an efficient way. If I want to do it in an efficient way, I shouldn't waste hardware in my brain or whatever it is to things that I don't know. I mean, this is waste of cells, waste of effort, waste of energy, waste of everything. So essentially, the argument is that we actually think of time or allocate hardware to time according to the amount of information that I have about the future. So let's say about the immediate future, I really have this amount of information, then I have this amount of information about this future, and this amount of information about this future, and so on and so forth. These curves, actually, we know quite a lot about them. They can grow either logarithmically, which is extremely slow, which means that in that case, those intervals of equal information are actually going to grow exponentially. Luckily enough, in most interesting world, this function actually grow like a power law, like a square root or something like this, which means that it's going a lot faster than log, which means that those intervals are not going to grow exponentially, but rather like some polynomial of time. But anyway, if this is square root, for example, this is going to go grow linearly, actually. But what is really interesting is that the hierarchy of perception should be dictated by intervals of equal information. So essentially, if I am thinking of time not as divided by what we call the physical or the Newtonian or whatever, the relativistic time, according to equal unit of time, our perception of time actually grows with equal information, then we should allocate resources in our brain in increasing intervals of time. So instead of thinking about the future in this planar linear way, we're actually thinking about the future in this distorted way where we allocate a lot more resources to larger and larger intervals. And one thing we were able to prove is that if you do that, and when you move from the standard time to this diluted time, what I call the equal information time, which means I'm thinking about the future not in equal times like there, but in growing intervals, then my future planning cone is going to be a lot more efficient. I'm going to be able to be robust against a lot more possible events than just when thinking about standard time. So this is a lot more efficient in terms of planning. It covers a lot more options. This is something which I usually call the fisheye perception of time. So essentially, we have this high resolution at near times, and the further we go into the past or the future, our resolution is distorted. So we have this view of the world in a very distorted way. Now, so first of all, this is a mathematical reality. I mean, planning with non-equal intervals of time is actually a very efficient way to do it. The question is, what determines those different levels of representations? And is it related really to those different levels of hierarchies that we get in perception and behavior according to, for example, the reverse hierarchy theory? And the answer is that we believe it does. And essentially, again, it has to do with the fact that solving the planning equations, I don't know if I want to show this or not, but essentially, in order to plan with these variables states, the states actually extended with time, I need to solve the equations of dynamics, which are, or the equation of reinforcement learning, for example, something like the Bellman equation for those of you who know what I'm talking about, which allows me essentially to efficiently recur in time using dynamic programming. In order to be able to do this, those percepts of states must obey very, very special conditions, because they have actually the transformation from this time to this time and from this time to this time essentially must be the same transformation. Otherwise, I'm unable to do this very, very long planning. Now, it turns out, again, something which, as a theoretician, is very satisfying, that if you impose those constraints on the equations of planning, there are very, very few solutions. Not everything is possible. And those very, very few solutions have to do with the emergence of complexity in the environment around us. So this is something which is still a work in progress, and there are very, very many ideas here which are not complete yet. One of the maybe most exciting aspects of this, and Noga again is involved in thinking about it, is that there is something that we are all very familiar with, which is called the human language, which actually reflects this hierarchy of perception and action in a very interesting way. So again, so human language, according to this fantasy, is actually reflecting the ability to think about longer and longer futures and further pasts. And essentially, if you really think about it, the amount of words that I dictate to every one of those intervals should be more or less the same, because the complexity allocated in my memory is more or less the same. And this has a prediction, which is also an observation about language, that the complexity of the language, as far as information that I gather, let's say in terms of complexity of the representation, how many words I'm using, or versus the accuracy of my language, I mean, how much I can actually express in terms of precision, is again something which I can plot as by values of information versus information. And it has a very interesting power law or self-similar structure. This is real words or real languages, and this is the way, to convince you that it's a power law, you just look at it in the logarithmic scale, you see very nice straight lines. And these power laws really reflect essentially this ability, that the self-similarity, that when I scale time again, I discover the same, or scale language in some sense, scale the concept that I'm using again, I discover the same structure, the same type of complexity again and again, which means that language really reflects this recursive ability to move across intervals of time in a very systematic way. It's a very hard constraint on the way we think about the world. So I just want to take it back to neuroscience. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. So I just want to relate it to two other things that you are going to see. So first of all, what I said so far sounds like fantasies. I mean, like ideas that people who are thinking about theory should entertain themselves with. It has absolutely no connection with real neuroscience. So there are two things that I want to tell you about. One of them is essentially the fact that we really know how to calculate those things. I mean, essentially how much should be represented in the brain in order to make prediction is a very simple exercise in the mathematics that we just mentioned. And with Eli and Elkin, based on experiments of Nachum Olenovsky many years ago, almost 15 years ago or something, we actually applied this particularly with Jonathan Rubin and Nachum and Eli to the analysis of neurons in the auditory cortex. And I believe Eli is going to mention it in some more detail in his talk later on this week. But essentially what we see there is the following. And we actually calculate how much a brain should be surprised by a next tone in a sequence of random tones. So this essentially, we are replacing in the environment here by two tones, which are randomly, an oddball paradigm of tones. And essentially, the only thing which is varying here is the probability, let's say, of blue versus red. So this is IID coin flips. And the only thing that it can change here is whether this coin flip has probability 0.1 for blue, or 0.3, or 0.5, or 0.7, or 0.9, and so on. These are the numbers we actually played with. And of course, if we are right that what the brain is trying to do is representing information about the future in a very efficient way, then the brain should somehow take some sort of statistics of the past and estimate the probability represented by some internal representation, which we call it here x hat, but from this make a prediction of the next tone. And essentially the surprise associated with the next tone should be related to my internal model of the statistics of the world. And that's precisely what we calculate very simply, actually, using a very simplified version of what we call the information bottleneck method. And if this is true, the neurons should respond to the surprise as calculated here. And this is precisely what we do in this experiment. So we actually take cells, what you see here is again these two, it is the dream of any theorist. Here we have the mathematical surprise as calculated from the theory, and here we have spike trains. And essentially, what we see here in two different ways, or actually in three different ways, what you see there is the histogram of spikes, or the PSTH, to these two tones. And eventually, besides this onset effect that shifts the two lines, you see a very nice linear relationship from surprise to neural responses. This is almost as good as you can imagine with this type of data. These are real cells with real neural data. I can actually show you the elementary events here. So this is just a single event, and you see that there is very nice relationship between surprise, as predicted by this model, that all we are trying to do is to minimize information about the past in order to make the most valuable predictions, and neural responses. So this is done, as you know, with anesthetized cats. And again, you can actually show that the best in terms of lying in this plane of information, complexity or how much you remember from the past versus your prediction of accuracy, you see that the cats lie in a very narrow region in space, where it's more or less the knee of this curve, which is the optimal in terms of diminishing returns, of efforts, minimal efforts in terms of memory, which gives you the most valuable predictions. And these are the anesthetized cats, so you can imagine that maybe in better conditions they'll do better. So this is one type of biologically related consequence or way of exploiting this type of formalism. The other one is a newer one, also done with Ellie, I think was mentioned today already in the first talk, which I missed, or one of the first talks. This is the water maze. And again, in a water maze, this is done with Nadav Amir and Elin Elkin on data taken from various sources. Essentially, you all know what a water maze is. I don't have to explain to you. But what is really interesting is that you can somehow quantify the complexity of the trajectory before and after learning, again using these ideas that our behavior is some sort of trade-off between information and value. And again, without getting into too many details, I mean, there's a quantitative difference in the way those mice behave in the pool before learning and after learning. So we all know that they tend to run around the pool at the beginning, and when they learn, they do a much more efficient trajectory. But the question is, okay, can we analyze in a somewhat more intelligent, or I don't know, more intelligent, more quantitative way? And what we did is essentially taking this paradigm of optimal control with information constraint, which is very closely related to things that people call KL control, or Emo Todorov, which is also here, is developed quite a lot further. And essentially, we just solve the mice behavior with this type of formalism. And one way of thinking about it is in terms of vector fields. So this is not the final analysis. We have actually much better pictures now, but this is more or less what we're thinking about. So before learning, each of those arrows represents essentially the average direction that the mice move at that point. And you see that before learning, it's very chaotic. It's not very clear. There are all sorts of curls in these vector fields. It's a very crude estimate. It's not really what happens. It's not very easy to estimate vector fields from trajectories, but there's still a very clear difference between the behavior, the vector fields, or the motion of the mice before learning and after learning. And we know, of course, that what they learn between those two things is the control. I mean, they learn how to find the target. And what is really very interesting, and I don't know to what extent Sagib actually mentioned this morning. So if you actually look at what happened after learning, we found something I found quite striking, is that they don't go directly to the target, as you could imagine if they really want to optimize the time in the pool, which is really the length of the pass, but actually do something quite remarkable. To me, they move first to the diameter that seems to orient at the target. And remember that they can see all sorts of signs around the pool, so they know more or less how to orient the azimuth, the direction. And then they more or less swing directly to the target. which is kind of funny. I mean, but that's exactly what I did when I had to navigate in the desert. You first orient yourself to the right direction and then take a straight walk and forget about everything else. So in some sense, they play with two parameters here. One is the value, which is the length of the swim, and the other one is the simplicity of the swim. I mean, how many decisions I have to take in order to get, and they somehow take the simplest, some sort of trade-off. And of course, when you give them more time, it turns out that they actually get more and more simple in the sense of less decisions to make. This is very much like, navigating home. One of the options that usually a GPS is giving you, they give you the fastest and the shortest. They should give you the simplest. The simplest is really make the least possible decisions. That's the way you want to describe it to your wife or something like this. Sorry for I mean, or give it over the phone to a friend in the shortest possible way. Anyway, so essentially what we'll do is really first know how to reach the goal and then simplify. Simplify by saving information. And these two parameters are critical. If we don't play with both of them, we don't really describe reality. And this is just two different aspects of the same story. So despite my effort to stretch this as much as I can, I'm more or less finished. So essentially, there are all sorts of ideas I just threw at you, but believe me that we believe that there is a lot more behind them. So first of all, there is this hierarchy of timescales that is related to the ability to think of times in terms of information rather than actual time, which leads to this notion of renormalizing the Bellman equation, which means work with states that describe longer and longer periods, which allow us to get all sorts of interesting information theoretic ideas about it. One of them, which I just want to mention very quickly, is this notion of discounting, which is some sort of useful mathematical tools in reinforcement learning, discounting reward, which actually turns out to follow from this ability to stretch information and reward together. If you actually want these two things to work together, the discounting, exponential discounting is related to the logarithmic predictive information, and the hyperbolic discounting, which is a big headache for the RL people because it doesn't scale well with the Bellman equation, is actually following directly from this renormalized Bellman equation if we stretch predictive information in a power law way. And there are other things that come out of it, like the hierarchies of different structures in various ways. So you see that in some sense, those ideas stretch from very basic principle, like minimize predictive information subject to value and cost, all the way, I believe, essentially just following the same principle again and again, all the way to things like what governs the structure of our language and maybe beyond that. Okay, so as I say, this was a slightly different different style of talk, but I think that this is also important. And I just want to thank some of the people there are many, many students I should have mentioned, but these are some of the people who helped me with formulating many of these ideas. So, particularly Bill Bialik, Danny Polani, Elin Elkin, and Pedro in the last year, and Ilya Nevenman was working on predictive information a long time ago. It also helped here. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.